So hello to everyone who's joined us today, and thank you for joining. I hope everyone can hear me and see the slides. This is our second session in this year's CChem conference. My name is Kim and I am the Accreditation and Chartered Chemist Programme Manager here at the Royal Society of Chemistry. Please note that this session is being recorded, and at the end of the session, the recording will go onto the members area and you'll be able to review it. We've already had a session on how to write CChem statements. This particular session will cover the evidence that you need to support those statements. I'm joined today by Martine and Sonalika, who are recent CChem awardees, and they will be giving you their top tips for putting your evidence together. Prior to that, I will give you a little talk about how to evidence your CChem application from an RSC point of view. We also have members of the CChem team on the call today. We have Claire, who's just given you a wave there, who will be answering any questions you put in the in the chat, and Louise, who's also our tech support today. If you do have any questions as we go through, please write them in the chat rather than the Q&A, and we will do our best to answer them. There is also a digital delegate bag, and Louise has just put that in the chat for you. This has all the slides from all the sessions on it, as well as some useful information about CChem, where to apply, and links to our guide to ethics and code of conduct. Those two will help you in your CChem application. So I will start my presentation and then we will hear from Martine and Sonalika, and there will be time for some extra questions at the end. So I'm going to talk about how to evidence your CChem application. So what are the expectations of the RSC for this evidence portfolio? A CChem application consists of a couple of parts. Firstly, you have 14 written statements. The word interview is there because if you've come through on an accredited scheme, you may also have an interview. The role of the statements is to show the assessors how you have met each of those attributes. It's the most important part of the application. We ask for 2 to 3 specific examples per attribute. And you need to explain how you conduct your work, you give reasons for your decisions, and explain the impact that your actions have had on your role. The impact is very important. The assessors will be looking for the things you do to have an impact on your work. The other part is the supporting evidence. This largely is there to corroborate the statements. What we look for is 1 or more piece of supporting evidence per attribute. Now you'll notice that we've asked for 2 to 3 examples per attribute, but only 1 piece of supporting evidence. You do not have to evidence every example, but you do have to evidence every attribute. The evidence must be related to the statements. So we would ask you to write in your statement, for example, I did a presentation on synthesis of a new catalyst, and then you will refer to that in your statement by saying see evidence C12, for example. So the evidence must be related to the statements. The other part of an application is your mentor comments. Once you have put your application in, we do ask your mentor to comment on each of the 5 overarching areas of the CChem application. So what is the role of the evidence? It corroborates the statements, as we have said. So the statements show us how you do it. The evidence confirms that you have done it, basically. They can also add a little bit more support to your statement, give a little bit more context. And in the same way, they can sometimes provide clarity or an example that you mentioned in your statement. This is secondary to your statements. The statements are still the more important part of the application. However, the evidence and your statements will be reviewed holistically by the assessors. So you will need to ensure that it is consistent. So, for example, if you talk about confidentiality in your statements and then in your evidence, you do not redact consistently, the assessors will look at that. So what are the requirements of this portfolio? It has to be real evidence, so we're looking for documentary evidence here. We ask you to submit the portfolio of evidence as one PDF. The evidence has to be less than 2 years old at the time of submission. If you have evidence that is older than 2 years and it's not been because of something like a maternity leave break or career break for something else, we will send it back to you and ask you to provide more recent evidence. It must be less than 45 pages. If it's more than 45 pages, again, we will send it back to you and ask you to reduce the number of pages. There are strategies for reducing the number of pages. For example, if you would like to include a report, we don't necessarily need the whole report. If you're just trying to show that you did indeed write a report, then we just need the title page that shows your part in it. So we need the title showing you as an author and the date. We don't need the whole report. Similarly with presentations, if you give a presentation, the first couple of slides should be enough so long as they have your name and the date on them. We would need translations if your evidence is not in English. And we need the evidence to be clear enough to read. So please don't put in very small pieces of evidence. Yes, the assessors can expand it on their screen, but often that leads to blurring. So please make sure that the evidence can be read. It should show your involvement or contribution to the activity clearly. We sometimes encounter examples where the person's name is not on a piece of evidence, and we would ask your mentor to sign the evidence to show that it is your work in that instance. You must relate the evidence to the attribute, so the evidence must be reflective of the attribute. And please make sure your evidence is GDPR compliant so that you've erased any or redacted any email addresses that you haven't been given permission to share, for example. You can include testimonials as evidence, but please make sure they're from colleagues and that they're signed. They can't be from your mentor. Your mentor makes comments at the very end, and do not accept testimonials from your mentor. The testimonials, as I've said, must be signed, they must be dated, and it must be clear that they come from the company or the institution. You must also label your evidence with the attribute to which it refers. We often get asked about confidential information. A lot of work people do is highly confidential, and they say they're not allowed to share anything, so we do have some strategies for that. The first one is to choose another less sensitive piece, which may sound obvious, but we advise people to think outside the box a little bit. So you may be able to select which pages of document that you share. There may be some pages that are more sensitive than others. There may be some pages that have things that are in the public domain on, so you can share that. You might be able to swap out a report for an email or a testimonial. You can redact parts of your evidence. We would advise to avoid simply using a black highlighter or placing black squares in, as that can be undone. So ensure that any redactions are permanent. And we would recommend then saving an image of your redacted Word document, especially saving as a PDF. The RSC can enter into a non-disclosure agreement if needed. We do occasionally interview without portfolio. That is very rare. Most people can actually give us confidential information using options 1 to 3. How do you bring all the evidence together? We see a variety of evidence, and to be honest, variety is key. The assessors will be looking for a variety of evidence. Things like reports, certificates, emails, screenshots, photographs, minutes from a meeting, an agenda from a meeting. We see all sorts of things, blog posts. Variety is key. If you send in an evidence portfolio that is made up completely of testimonies, for example, we will send it back to you and ask if you can provide some other evidence. So some ideas for capturing evidence. It must be based on something that happened. Think about how you tell others of your work, what the outputs from your work are, and what the inputs are, what recommendations you make. You could create digital or hard evidence of conversations or meetings by sending an email after a meeting or event summarising the key points and items or actions agreed. You could also send a follow-up email or report on progress. We've already talked about testimonials, but often people give you feedback and you can use that. For example, you may have a PDR review or an appraisal, and you might be able to use some of that. The mentor comments can add weight, and often the assessors will turn to the mentor comments if some things aren't clear in your statements. So I'm now going to go through some mock examples. So if you're going to put in a report or some technical document, we expect to see the title of the report. You can redact project names or chemical names. We need to see your contribution to that report. That's presumably you'll be an author or a co-author. As you can see, it's labelled with attribute A1. That's quite important as well. There needs to be some content on there, and it needs to be relevant to your written statement for A1. So how does this piece of evidence show that you have met attribute A1? You can redact confidential parts. As you can see there, we've redacted some of the functional groups. We need to have a date on it, and it needs to be from within the last 2 years. If there's anything not within the last 2 years, we will send it back and ask for a more recent example. Date it was written or published or approved, it must be within the past 2 years, as I've just said. I can't really emphasise that enough. We will send it back if it is outside that time limit. You can put in a certificate. A lot of people put in certificates for attribute A2, which is about how you keep up with the chemistry knowledge. For that, we would need you as a named person on the certificate. Again, you need to put the attribute name or number on there. The course name must be relevant to your written statement for A2. So if in A2 you say, I recently attended a GCMS conference, and you talk about that and how you applied it when you went back to work, we would expect the course name to be GCMS interpretation or something. If you put in a different course there, make sure you refer to it back in your statements. We need to know when it was completed or awarded. Again, it must be within the past 2 years. I'm going to say this a lot, I'm afraid. And the certificate must be awarded by a proper organisation. We've talked about testimonials before. We need the letterhead. We need, again, the attribute name or number, the details of the person providing the testimonial. This cannot be your mentor. We need a date when it was written, must be from within the last 2 years. And the content of the testimonial, if you ask someone from a testimonial, we would strongly advise that you also ask them to reflect back the words in the attribute and to reflect how you have met that attribute, rather than just giving a general testimonial about how well you perform at work. It must be specific to demonstrate the attribute that you're using it for. So those are a few examples of how to present your evidence. We're just going to talk through some common pitfalls, some things that we have seen. If you put photographs in rather than scans, they can be sometimes quite blurry. So please ensure if you use even if you use scans actually, that they are clear and easy to read. Think about the assessors. There's going to be someone looking through this, and those assessors will want to match your attribute and your evidence, which is why we ask you to label it. And they need to be able to read it clearly. They don't really want to have to mess about trying to read a blurry photograph or a blurry scan. So please think about the assessors. We sometimes see a lack of a name or a date on the evidence. We do need to be able to relate that evidence to yourself, and we do need to know that it's within the past 2 years. If for any reason your name or a date is not on that evidence, you will need to ask your mentor to sign it to say that they confirm it is your work and they can confirm it was done within the last 2 years. Please don't submit separate PDFs for each attribute or group. Please submit it as one complete PDF. And please check for your GDPR compliance, particularly if you're sharing an email trail. So please ensure that names and addresses are removed from any evidence that's in there. We have a few do's and don'ts for you. Again, please do not submit evidence that is older than 2 years. We will send it back. Please do not submit more than 45 pages. again, we will send it back. Multiple documents as evidence. We really only need one piece of evidence for each attribute. There may be occasions where you might need to put in a couple of pieces of evidence. For example, some of the attributes do ask for more than one. They have more than one thing that you ask to meet. So you might think it's better to submit a couple of pieces of evidence. That is fine. If you're using a piece of evidence for more than one attribute, please only put it in once and refer back to it. If you are using one piece of evidence for more than one attribute, please ensure in your statements that the evidence actually reflects both of those attributes and that your statement actually shows why that piece of evidence meets that particular attribute. So you would have to write your statements from a slightly different viewpoint if you're using the same piece of evidence for each of those attributes to make sure that it meets that attribute. Again, testimonials cannot be from your mentor. We will send it back if that is the case and ask you to find a testimonial from somebody else. Please don't submit the evidence that's too small to read. If they can't read it, they can't review it. And please don't submit irrelevant evidence that's not referred to in your written statement. So please don't just think, oh, I'll just put some papers in so that they can see how good my chemistry output is. Everything must refer to those attributes. So having done the do nots, here are some do's. It's helpful if you include a contents table as well as labelling the individual attribute. Abbreviations, please include an abbreviations list. It is quite difficult when assessors are reading statements and they're just scattered with abbreviations that the assessor does not know what that abbreviation stands for. Again, one clear piece of evidence per example. We would really ideally like to see one piece of evidence per page as well. Bear in mind, the assessors will be flicking between the statements and the evidence. So the easier you can make it for them, the better that will be. Choose wisely. So aim for 20 to 30 pages. 45 is the absolute maximum we will accept. Ooh. And they are looking for your contribution. I think when we did the statements last week, we did point out that the assessors want to know what you did. This is your Chartered Chemist application. It all has to be about you, and we advise you to write those statements in the first person. So on your evidence, the contribution you made should be evident on that particular piece that you choose. And again, please make sure that you cross-reference between statements and evidence so that in your statements you refer to the piece of evidence. So our top tips, we don't need to see the whole document. And this is how you can get it to below 45 pages. The first page of a report or a few slides will be suitable. I've said this several times, the mentor if we can countersign to confirm the evidence is your work. Show through doing. So under attribute C, we are looking for communication skills. Your application is assessed holistically. So if your actual overall application is confused, that doesn't reflect good communication skills. So bear in mind that as well. We do have a lot of support available to you. There's a lot of guidance online, particularly in the members area. There are some examples there as well. We also offer one-to-one consultations where we will talk to you and discuss how to demonstrate your attributes, how you plan your application, and we can review your submission. There are CChem cafes every month, well, most months. They're themed and they're peer-to-peer discussions. So they feature regular guests. Sometimes we have assessors on there, mostly it's staff from the RSC. But it does give you the chance to meet other applicants and share ideas for how to perhaps overcome the confidentiality issue, for example. Email support is available. Louise, could you put the email CChem@RSC in the chat? Thank you. And we can help you in finding a mentor. I think that's possibly me done. Thanks, Louise. So that is me done. I'm going to hand over to Martine, who will give you a member perspective, and that will probably be a lot more interesting than my talk. So over to you, Martine. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, Louise and Claire, for inviting me to this talk. I'm Martine Mirza. If we can just flick on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. So at the moment, I'm a senior materials and analytical scientist. Before that, I was a research fellow. My research area was based on electrochemical processing in molten salts, looking at refractory metal recovery and nuclear materials processing. Last year I was awarded the CChem, and more recently I've been awarded Chartered Scientist. Next slide, please. So I'll be covering a number of themes that I was asked to prepare for. The first question was, what were some of the reasons behind my application for CChem? So I sort of broke this down into two parts, sort of the short-term considerations and the longer-term considerations. In terms of short-term, it was really an opportunity to reflect on the work that I had done over the last 2 years, the professional experience I'd gained. It wasn't simply a tick box activity. It was a chance to review and reflect and look at strengths as well as weaknesses that I had sort of identified and map them onto the CChem attributes, which is pretty key. It's a chance for you to also collect and record your activities, and that's an important part of your continuous professional development. In terms of longer term considerations, well, they go without saying, it's your commitment to continuous professional development, which is key going forward, greater credibility in the STEM workforce, demonstration of your professional excellence, as well as self-esteem. And not everybody will have a PhD, but CChem awards your workplace experience, and you don't need to have a PhD to be awarded CChem. So that's something to highlight. Next slide, please. So this has come up quite a lot, how to deal with confidential evidence, and it's kind of part and parcel of working in industry, that you'll be working on projects and tasks which are of a confidential nature. And the first thing is, I think Kim mentioned this as well, it's about identifying whether the task is, or the piece of evidence you're going to put into your portfolio is necessary. Can you use something alternative to that? And if you can't, it's about redacting some of that material. And when you do choose to redact, make sure that you sort of convert your Word documents into PDF formats. If you send your file as a Word document, it can be easily uncovered, and whatever image or figure or words you were trying to cover, they'll be apparent to your assessor. Of course, removing all personal details of stakeholders, product names as well, something to bear in mind in line with GDPR and your company regulations and rules. My company had a sort of in-house CChem accredited route, so I was able to circumvent some of the classification restrictions. It's well worth finding out if in your organization you have that same capability. And then I also asked my colleagues to review the evidence I was intending to share, and for them to sort of chip in and provide their expertise as to the necessity of including it in a portfolio. So I'll give you an example. I was asked to review a modeling report, and the comments I had sort of added on the Word file were in text. Now, I couldn't actually screenshot any of those comments because of the confidential nature of the report. But I was lucky enough to have an email chain which basically requested that piece of work from myself, and I had the date and my name. But I was thinking about this in hindsight. Let's say if I hadn't had that email, what would I have done? I would have sought a testimonial from that particular person, which basically confirmed my role in the task and my personal impact. I think that's pretty key when it comes to your evidence. It's your personal impact in a particular project. Next slide, please. What were some of the challenges I faced? So I guess it comes down to selecting the right piece of evidence for each attribute, for each of the attributes that you're mapping onto, and more importantly, understanding your contribution to a task. In industry, as well as in academia, a lot of tasks are completed as part of a team. Journal publications are with multiple authors, especially in the STEM field. And whereas in a publication, you can delineate your role, it's kind of difficult when it's an internal report sometimes in industry. So it's about getting a testimonial from a colleague to sort of verify your role in that project and your personal impact, and finding examples which are relevant and have impact. So I'll go on to the D1 and the D2. So those are two attributes which look at healthy and safe. So your contribution to a healthy and safe working environment, as well as contributing to a sustainable future. So think outside the box. Sometimes it's not your contribution within the workplace that meets that criteria. So for the D2 specifically, contributing to a sustainable future, I'd attended a local primary school and as a volunteer, and was basically informing pupils about water conservation. And I used that as an example, as a means to contribute to a sustainable future. So I explained water conservation and our business strategy, and how we sort of look to conserve water in various ways. So essentially, your examples do not always have to be directly relevant to your work. Next slide, please. So the role of the mentor. The mentor is a pivotal person in your CChem journey. And they should be able to basically empower you, give you the tools that you need to basically lead your career journey and make the decisions. And essentially, so look at where your strengths are, identify those and tick them off, but also look at your weaknesses and where you need to sort of develop and improve further. And that's where your mentor can be really, really useful, because they can guide and suggest potential examples, but ultimately make sure you're doing the thinking part. Also, they will most likely have a greater network, and that's well worth tapping into, especially as part of your CChem journey. And that sort of interaction between yourself as a mentee and a mentor, it's about reflecting on examples, talking through them, and using that STAR technique as well. So a few tips from my end. Know, as Kim said, your portfolio of evidence shows your assessor, your attention to detail, your ability to organize information and accuracy of content. So make sure you do double check spelling, punctuation, grammar, as well as your communication as well through that piece of work. Include a contents table, something I did and something I'd highly recommend you do as well. And it basically makes it a lot easier to find, to identify the attribute and to find that evidence that maps on a particular page number. Use a variety of examples. Using a variety of examples demonstrates the breadth of your workplace experience. I know that you can use one evidence piece against 3 attributes, but try and use multiple, demonstrating that breadth. Ensure your images are legible and not pixelated, and make sure that when you do screenshot, that is the case, because something that cannot be read cannot be reviewed. And if you do redact information because you've got confidential reports or work, make sure if you don't have a redaction tool or software and you're just using Word, that you convert to PDF. I think that's it from me.
Thank you, Martine. That was very insightful. I do have a couple of questions for you, if you're happy to answer.
Yeah, sure.
So I wonder if you could just talk to us a little about what your primary considerations were when working out which piece of evidence to use.
So I think it comes down to the recency of the evidence you're going to select. So it has to be within those 2 years before you submit. And then it's about the suitability of the evidence that you're going to be using. So the suitability of it when mapped against the attribute. And then also it has to have your name, the date, the authenticity has to be there, that you were the one who has contributed to, let's say, a publication, a journal article, and your role in it. That's what I would really sort of nail down.
Thank you. And could I just ask you, if you had to do it all over again, is there anything you would do differently?
Yeah, I think for me, it would be about the breadth of examples I used. I think I did use multiple pieces of evidence for attributes. And I just think if I had gone back, I would have done it, differently. I'd identified more of my weaknesses, identified where my pitfalls were in the application, and really thought about what I could do to learn and improve, and also get those evidence pieces together through my workplace. The other thing is, and you don't often do it, but talking to your colleagues in your teams, chatting through from some of the examples. And sometimes it's work that you don't really recognize, or you might not think about is a suitable example that might really be that really good example. So having a chat with your line manager, your wider team, might sort of jolt of your ideas and make you think a little further. I did that project and that task, and I've completely forgotten about it. And that might be a key evidence piece against a particular attribute.
That's great. Thank you very much. Some great tips there, Martine. Claire, were there any questions on the chat, particularly for Martine?
No, there's been a few sort of general questions. So, Martina, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to go rogue here.
Sure.
One of the questions that we often see is that candidates wait to provide, I'm going to put this in quotes, the best evidence.
Mm-hmm.
How do you balance this idea between best and good enough? And was that your experience when you were putting your CChem application together?
I mean, of course, having a better piece of evidence is going to look better for your assessor. But at the end of the day, the CChem is a review of your professional work experience holistically, and it covers a number of attributes. And whilst you may have a very strong evidence piece against one attribute, that shouldn't sort of downplay the other evidence pieces you have. So if you do feel that you're in a position where you can submit, then you should. You shouldn't just wait on an evidence that's sort of a publication, let's say in Nature, for example, that's going to be coming 2 months down the line. You shouldn't just wait for that, because your other publications and your other pieces of work and your other evidences will also hold weight, and that's something you should consider.
Thank you. And thank you, Claire. So I think we'll move on to Sonalika now. So Sonalika, are you happy to take over now?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you. Yes, I can hear you.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here today. Really great to be here. And it's actually really interesting to be hearing, this session from the other end now that I've finished my CChem, as opposed to when I was actually going through the journey and trying to get as much intel as possible to make sure that my portfolio was the best it can be. So I apologies in advance if there's any noise in the background. I'm at a conference today. I'm doing my best to find a quiet space. So today I really wanted to share with you my CChem journey. I want to talk about what were my motivations, the questions I had, the challenges that I faced or thought I would face, some insights into what type of evidence that I used and some tips around that, and then finally linking the CChem to wider career development. But next slide, please. One more slide, thank you. Let me just begin with a brief overview of how I got to where I am today. So I did my integrated master's in chemistry with a year in industry from Imperial College London, and I graduated back in 2018. Now, before entering my final year, I chose to do the year in industry at a contract research organization, essentially a service provider for both the pharmaceutical and food industries, RSL, based in Reading. Now, once I finished the year in industry, I returned to finish my final year at Imperial. And when I graduated, I had the choice of applying for further studies, maybe a PhD, or going back into the industry, as I had a job offer from RSL. After a few years in the lab, I decided it was time for a change. So I took a leap of faith and took on a role of research partner within the food R&D part of the business. And I'll touch on that in a bit, as this is critical for my CChem. And as you can see, back in a couple of years ago is when I got awarded for CChem. My current responsibilities include leveraging government grants for our business and also helping our clients with their R&D programs, collaborative R&D. this particular year, I'm also the project lead for a Key Innovate UK project. It's a multi-partner initiative where we're helping to set up the UK's first novel foods expert network for regulatory challenges. Next slide, please.
Sally, could I just ask you to lean a bit forward into your microphone? We've just had somebody say the sound isn't very clear.
Is this better?
That sounds better to me.
Okay, great. All right. So
thank you.
Next slide, please. As you just heard, as you go on your personal career journey, it's really important to be aware of and seek out professional qualifications that can validate your progress and your learnings and give you self-confidence as well, and give the industry confidence in you. And the Chartered Chemist Award does exactly that. It's an excellent example. Now, how did I get involved in the CChem? So initially, I had heard about the CChem at university back in around 2017 or so, when the RFP had come to present. Now, at that time, I thought it was a really interesting proposition, but I wasn't quite eligible to apply given the requirements, so I kept it in mind. Then when I joined RSFL, I actually heard a colleague complete their CChem and it was announced in the business, and that brought it back in front of the table for me. So I explored the option, had a conversation with my manager, had a conversation with my a potential CChem supervisor as well, and I decided to pursue it. And of course, I had personal aspirations, right? My reasons for pursuing the chartership were quite simple. As you heard Martina as well talk, right? You're doing a lot of valuable work when you enter the professional world. And often it tends not to be captured unless, for example, you're preparing for an interview, but it's only the interviewer who sees that at that point. I found that I was keeping myself engaged both in the lab and outside the lab as well in the wider business. I wanted to turn these experiences I was gaining into a milestone and formalize it. In essence, I really like the way that Martina put it. It's a recognition of your professional experience. As I looked more into it, I also found that I could leverage the CChem journey to fill gaps in my experiences, which would automatically help me carve out a learning path for myself and seek out new opportunities, especially as I was fairly early on in my career. Next slide, please. So what's interesting about my CChem journey is how it unfolded across two different roles. A few years ago, so I joined RSFL back as a scientist in the lab, and I mentioned after a few years, I decided it was time for a career move, which to me was a big career move for me. And I was moving from an analytical scientist to a research partner. Not only did this mean that I was leaving the lab, but also it meant switching industries from pharma to food, where I had zero experience and knowledge. And also moving into a completely new, undefined role with no precedence, not even a team to begin with. I'm happy to say that we have 4 people on the team now. And so my CChem was split across 2 very, very distinct roles. And naturally, I was very hesitant and unsure whether my new role would give me the opportunity and experience that I needed to fulfill the CChem. And I remember having multiple conversations with my manager, my old manager, and my new to-be manager at that time, as well as my mentor, because it was right in the middle of my CChem that I was switching. And it turns out I realized that the whole purpose of a CChem is to help you get a well-rounded professional experience and embed well-rounded qualities in the chemical sciences. So I didn't have to be in the lab for this. In fact, the 2 roles that I did balance each other out beautifully, as you can see on the slide. I've tried to demonstrate the set of skills and attributes that I was able to demonstrate as a scientist, and then the set of skills that I got under my belt as a research partner. So in my lab role, I gained a solid technical foundation, which covers the first couple of attributes, especially attribute A. It helped me to foster problem solving, critical thinking, and I was involved in hands-on practical work in the lab, so I was naturally enhancing my knowledge of chemical sciences as well as contributing to it. Then when I shifted to the research partner role, the flavor changed completely as I was entering a world of stakeholder management and business development with a science hat on still. And suddenly now, instead of doing the science and innovation, I was facilitating the science and innovation. And the skills required there were very different, but in fact, the CChem offered attributes that almost supported this journey for me, because things like influencing skills, or taking on feedback, or navigating a different perspective from a team member, for example. This is very much what I was experiencing in my new role. Now, I'll dive a bit more into the specifics of these attributes and the types of evidence that I used in a couple of slides' time. But first, I wanted to highlight some of the recurring challenges that I ran into right at the start. Next slide, please. So to those of you who are already on the journey, some of these may sound familiar. Number one was, as we already heard, was identifying the right opportunity and the right pieces of evidence. It's not always obvious what counts as evidence and what could count as evidence. And sometimes you have to be very creative in that process. Creative in terms of how do I turn everyday scenarios into concrete pieces of evidence that I can put forward to the executives. Equally, I had to balance my submission. So some attributes I found had lots of examples, whereas others had hardly any. So that automatically pointed out where I needed to improve. Second, it was systematic record keeping. So, once you start collecting everything, you quickly can get very overwhelmed. I found it really hard to manage the overlap between the attributes. The same item that I was collecting could demonstrate several attributes I found. And I needed a way to pick the best piece of evidence, as we just heard, per attribute without repeating myself over and over again, and making sure that I maintain some variety. I also had to force myself, actually, when I was writing reflections, to be concise and avoid waffle. And I tried to make sure that I used, that every sentence added value. And then finally, the third piece was coherent storytelling through my portfolio. Collecting evidence is one thing, like step number one, but presenting it in a way that the reviewer and the assessor can follow a clear narrative is another. And like you heard, it's a testament to how well you can communicate. So you might as well put your best effort into it. I wanted the portfolio to read as a single story about how my responsibilities, my autonomy, and my impact as an individual, as a professional, evolved over the 2 years, rather than just a disconnected file dump, if I can put it that way. Now, I'll say this, 2 years can feel like a long time when you start off your CChem journey. So my recommendation would be to have an action plan right at the start. I certainly needed one to make sure that I carved out the right experiences for myself over the 2 different roles. And the plan doesn't have to be fixed. It can evolve along the way, but make sure you have a plan. And, it will avoid the situation where you reach towards the end of your CChem and you realize, oh, actually, I'm missing, evidence for attributes X, Y, and Z. Next slide, please. Now, let's take a step back for a moment to the first challenge that I pointed out, which was identifying the right opportunities and then subsequently finding the right piece of evidence to support that. I've tried to pull together for you a Venn diagram to show the synergies that I had between the 2 roles that I was doing across my CChem in the lab and outside the labs, and how I tried to reframe what may seem as daily work documents, activities, or tasks into evidence for the portfolio. So inside the bubbles, I've put the evidence types that I've used, and each one of these links, as you can see, to an arrow outside the bubbles, which highlights the specific attribute that I tried to link it with. These are just some examples. It doesn't cover my whole portfolio. Now, for example, on the scientist side, the pink bubble, I used lab reports to demonstrate my existing knowledge of the chemical sciences. I took snapshots of those, maybe the front cover, as well as, a part that showed method development, for example. But on the development of my technical knowledge, I used technical forums, for example, attending technical forums. But it was important also to demonstrate not just that I attended it, but what did I do with that information? I used training records to capture how I trained up a junior in the lab on a particular technique, analytical technique, and this showed autonomy. I used the training, the signed off training records as evidence there. We've already heard about confidentiality, and for me, the accountability associated with this came through signing off results for a client. So confidentiality for clients in our business is absolutely key. And so confidentiality agreements or signing off a certificate of analysis were bits that I used. Also, on a very different note, in terms of confidentiality, when you're compiling your portfolio, we heard that it's absolutely fine to redact pieces of information so that you preserve the nature of confidential information. Just make sure that you're not redacting too much information that it compromises the nature of your piece of evidence. You may need to look in a different direction if that starts to, reduce the value of your piece of information. So I would also just double check with your manager as well as your mentor on what you cannot display in your portfolio. I also, as you go down that list on the pink side, I took screenshots of the email chain with a client where I explained, for example, why a certain analysis did not work, and there's steps that I'm taking to problem solve it or troubleshoot it and get down to the root cause analysis. So, these are a lot of the conversations that you have at work tend not to be captured. So I started to think about how can I capture it and put it down, for example, in an email. Now, if you look on the right-hand side on, when I came out of the lab, suddenly my pieces of evidence started to change, and I had to be quite creative when it comes to the soft skills. So I started to post more on LinkedIn about some of the conferences that I was going to, or some of the community engagement that I was doing and being involved in the scientific community. So I used that as evidence. I already mentioned confidentiality agreements that I was creating between clients. So I used the sign-off page, for example, blurred out the signatures that were not mine, just to show that, I have integrity that I'm demonstrating there. Now I use email chains here as well between teams, internal teams, between other stakeholders as well. This was to showcase where I had influence over a particular direction of a project, for example, or where potentially a colleague or a client had a very different view to mine, and I showed how I justified my views on a particular project, so I could use that as evidence. And then teamwork was an interesting one because a lot of teamwork, I had to think quite carefully on this one. A lot of our teamwork would happen in person, and not a lot would be captured. So I started to think very carefully in a way that I could show that I contributed to the teamwork. It's very easy to showcase, look, this is a project that we've done as a team. But going back to what we said, that it needs to have your stamp on it, and you made an impact. So I started to think about meeting agendas. I was creating quite a few meeting agendas that would outline what the objective is, what do you want to get out of it. It would show collaborative spirit as well. And it would have my name against several of the meeting agenda items as well. So I used that as a piece of evidence to demonstrate teamwork. And then as part of my role, I also leverage government government funding and write grant applications in certain scenarios. So I automatically have to think about budgets. I have to think about resource for doing a particular project. So I was able to use elements of the grant application that I'm putting together to demonstrate that I'm able to think about resource management. And of course, you've got the middle piece there, where there are some common areas that I could dip into across the two roles, such as lines from my appraisal and from my performance review, or calendar snapshots to demonstrate time management. There was a point in time that I had a transition between both these roles, and I was doing half the time one role, half the time another role. So there was a really nice piece that I could demonstrate in how I managed the two roles at once. Now, in terms of developing your portfolio, I wanted to do everything on a PowerPoint deck. So I captured screenshots of my evidence and I collated them on a PowerPoint deck, and allowed me some flexibility in shaping it and designing it the way I wanted to communicate my experience and making sure that there was a narrative. And the most important thing is, remember, it's an assessor who's going to be reading this, and assessors are also going to loads and loads of CChem applications. So how do you make your portfolio clear as well as friendly and a pleasant journey for the assessors to go through? Have a think about that. And now I'd like to just touch on the second challenge that I had mentioned, which was systematic record keeping. It can be it's very easy to get lost in all of this evidence that you're trying to collate. So let me share with you a simple mapping tool that I devised to spot gaps and to avoid duplication. Next slide, please. So I built a map for myself on a spreadsheet, which then I copied and pasted onto my PowerPoint slides. And essentially, I wanted to do this to help me understand where are my strengths and where are my weaknesses. So on the left-hand side, I listed every piece of evidence that I had. And on the right, I made columns for the 14 attributes and marked which evidence demonstrated which attribute the best. So you can see a bit of a color map going on there. And very quickly, each color is for each letter attribute. So A is green, B is blue, for example. And very quickly, I can start to see where I was heavy and where I was light. I chose to put in 2 pieces of evidence per attribute. And I echo what Martine was actually just saying, that although the requirements are the minimum of 1 piece for most attributes, I wanted to make the CChem serve as a rich record for myself. And so I didn't want to fall into the tick box exercise mindset. So I challenged myself to make sure that I had 2 pieces of evidence per attribute. But I was also very aware that some of the other pieces of evidence were linking in and demonstrating some of the other attributes naturally. So I wanted to understand what that map could look like, which is why you can see I've got 1 and 2 as the primary pieces of evidence listed on the map. And then I've got the colored boxes without the numbers, just to demonstrate, hey, look, this piece of evidence also demonstrates attribute, for example, A1, but also demonstrates attribute B2. It gave me a really nice overview of what I was compiling. The 2 attributes that I chose, I had to very carefully think about which ones were the clearest and the most impactful. And it was a very good question posed earlier about, where do you draw the line between the best piece of evidence versus, good enough? And it's very much down to your personal preference and, what you feel could be the most impactful story. At the end of the day, your portfolio is being presented as a full portfolio. So the evidence is there for the assessors to go back and link up the different attributes as well. So don't feel like you're leaving out if you don't choose the best attribute, which is why I wanted to put this mapping exercise to demonstrate that, yes, I've chosen to put forward evidence A for this particular attribute, but, this actually, a couple of other pieces of evidence could also fall into that, under that attribute. Now, initially, this tool was something that I was just using to triage my experiences for myself. But it became very clear to me very early on that it was a really nice, clear and visual way to represent an overview of the portfolio, almost like a visual contents page for the assessors. So I cleaned it up and decided to include it in my portfolio, and you can see a screenshot as it was in my portfolio right there. Next slide, please. Now, completing my CChem wasn't just about pulling a portfolio together, submitting it, and just getting a CChem under my belt. It's something that continues to benefit me day to day. So first of all, it gave me a really fulfilling way to reflect on past, current, and future experiences. And we don't often take time to reflect on these experiences because we're so focused on what the next thing is to do on our to-do list. And so it forced me to take time out and reflect and give that importance. Second, it's helped me to build a much more balanced, structured, and an all-rounded professional profile. And I could really feel that being shaped over the 2 years that I did my CChem on. Thirdly, it now acts as a framework for how I approach new opportunities. So when something comes up, I find myself naturally thinking in terms of which skills and attributes that will help me grow. And then finally, it's become a bit of a self-assessment tool for myself and really a mindset. It encourages me to keep checking in on my own development and to push myself one step further. And if you think, of other attributes that are not necessarily captured in the CChem, thinking long-term, nothing's stopping you from creating your own bespoke set of attributes outside the 14 or in addition to the 14 that can serve as your personal set that you measure yourself against as you move through your career once you've done the CChem. The CChem has given you the training and the framework that you need, which you can then adapt as you'd like. Next slide, please. Now, sorry, I didn't realize there were a couple of slides on there just on career development that I'd spoken to Nelly about, and I wasn't sure whether I should include them or not. So it's fine if they're not there. I just wanted to highlight a couple of links to career development. The CChem is a stepping stone for your career development. And we know that the road to success in science isn't always smooth. We all hit different barriers at different times. And essentially the 2 slides that I had were just a list of different barriers that I felt someone working in a STEM professional space could encounter. I just wanted to highlight maybe 2. One is imposter syndrome. The CChem helps cut through that. It's not just, you or your manager saying that you did a good job, but you're not feeling that you're really up to it, and you're not sure if it's the right, next step, for example, or if you got the skill set. The CChem is a professional recognition that's peer reviewed, so you're getting a stamp of approval from the professional body, in essence. So it can help on the imposter syndrome side. Second was the lack of direction. The CChem can make you stop and take stock. It helps you see where you've come from, what skills you're strong in, and where you may want to grow next. And that type of clarity can shape your next career move. And then finally, on the opposite side, if I talk about career accelerators just very quickly, the CChem itself is a career accelerator. It gives you a solid structure to build both, and this is the beauty of it, to build both technical and soft skills, because they're both equally important in the industry if you're going in as a professional. And it's something that all employers value, regardless of whether you're in the chemical sciences or if you're shifting outside the chemical sciences. They will serve you well. And the CChem journey activates quite a few other accelerators along the way. For example, your communication skills, you're naturally sharpening them by nature of you pulling together a portfolio. You can also activate some other accelerators, for example, feedback, getting feedback and showing that you are interested in progressing and taking on feedback. It not only gives you stronger evidence, but it also helps you to have continuous improvement as a professional. So with that, I just wanted to highlight that the value of the CChem isn't limited to the 2-year journey. It's a professional toolkit that I will always carry forward for years to come, and I hope that you will do the same. Thank you.
That's great, Sonalika. Thank you very much for your insightful talk. I have a couple of questions for you, if you wouldn't mind answering. I just wondered how you made your evidence selection feed into your statements. Did you find you had to rewrite any statements once you'd selected your piece of evidence?
That's a good question. Yes, I did have to rewrite some pieces of evidence, but I have to, some statements, but I have to say that I made sure that my evidence was collected. And I worked on finalizing the evidence before I went on to writing the statement. So I had written a couple of points just to remind myself of what is it that I wanted to talk about in relation to this evidence. So I very much focused on my PowerPoint deck and my portfolio before I went into the statements piece. Overall, I used the STAR model to write my statements, and it was already mentioned: the situation, task, action, and result. In fact, the result piece I treated more as a personal impact, so I'm glad that was mentioned. Personal impact for personal growth, learning, as well as for the business. For some attributes, I chose 2 examples that were sequential. For example, I chose to show a poster that I made when I attended a conference to share learnings. And then following on from that, thanks to my learnings, I was able to attend a road mapping exercise and apply my learnings. So I used 2 sort of sequential pieces of evidence. So, those 2 experiences came within maybe 5 months of each other. So I did choose to change my evidence that I was presenting. And then others were fairly standalone. So I didn't have to change too much there.
That's great, thank you. And just one more question from me. What's your top piece of advice that you'd like to share with CChem applicants?
I've got two. One is don't treat it as a tick box exercise. Treat it as a way for you to document and reflect on your journey, because that's what's going to make the CChem powerful, not only for today, but for a lifetime. And then finally, it would be to take pride in how you present it. It's your hard work and it's your experience that you're showcasing. So take the assessor on your professional journey, because you will look back, and just as you reflected on your CChem while you were putting the CChem, applying for the CChem, you will also reflect on it, for example, as I did when I was pulling this presentation together, and it's very fulfilling.
Thank you very much, Sonalika. So we've come up to questions. Claire, were there any specific ones for Sonalika in the chat?
There's not any in the chat. We'll just give people a couple of moments to maybe reflect and think of some. But I've got a question for you, Sonalika. How did you kind of go about like managing your evidence, for example? And have you got any tips to people about how they could maybe record keep or file? Obviously, it's quite a big piece of documentation that you're putting together, anything between, 20 to maybe 45 pages. Did you have anything that you did to help you keep a track of all of the evidence that you'd got and keep it nice and organised?
Sure, that's a great question. So as and when I started to gather evidence, what I did was I saved it as an image, if it's a screenshot, or a PDF, for example, that I would later take a screenshot from, into various folders. So what I'd done was I'd made a folder in my OneDrive as CChem, and I made separate folders for attribute A, B, C, D, E. And within that, I started to almost dump each piece of evidence that I had, and I named it so that it was A1 dash the name of the evidence, so that I would remember what it is, A2 dash the name of the evidence. And then, once that started to grow and grow, that's when I brought in the mapping tool for myself, where I collated everything on an Excel spreadsheet. So I could take, keep tabs on what piece of evidence is linking in with which attribute. So I could then triage for myself on what I wanted to choose to present.
Brilliant, that's really good advice. I have a question for you, Sonalika, from Sophie. You mentioned you tried to write a story throughout your application about your growth. How did you go about creating that story if the evidence or attributes wasn't chronological?
That's a good question. So when I said I was trying to create a story that was less of a chronological story, but more of a narrative to show how I've developed from a scientist in the lab to a scientist outside the lab. And it was very much a story of skills that I've developed. So, for example, stakeholder management. How did I navigate stakeholder management? How did I navigate working through opposing reviews, for example? And that, in essence, each statement that I wrote for every attribute, I mentioned I used the STAR framework. That in itself was a mini story, just to take, the assessor on the journey. That what did I do? What was the scenario? What were my personal actions and my thought process and how I could approach that? Because a lot of these attributes are soft skills. So I was taking the assessor on a journey with me. And I think looking back at my portfolio, although it's not a chronological order, you can still see that I've grown as a professional. By seeing how, where I didn't necessarily have attributes under my belt or skills before, I have developed them over time by how I explained it in the statement. I hope that helps.
Brilliant, thank you, Sonalika. There is still time for people to ask questions, but I'm going to come to Martine next, if you might answer a question that I've got for you, Martine. And it's about that CChem mentor-mentee relationship. Have you got any guidance for applicants about how they can really make the most of that relationship? Because sometimes it can be quite difficult for applicants to know maybe what to speak to their mentor about or what to raise with them.
So Claire, I think Martine had to drop off.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
So Nalika then, could you maybe answer that one?
Sure. Do you mind just repeating that slightly? Because you got cut off for me in the middle.
Yeah. So it's about how you kind of navigated that CChem mentor-mentee relationship, because sometimes it can be quite difficult for applicants maybe to know what to support to get from their CChem mentor, maybe what to discuss with them, how to approach it, you know, how they can best make the use of that support that your mentor is offering.
Sure. So I'll be honest, I was a little confused at the start on how I was supposed to now, what could I leverage my mentor for? I was very fortunate that the mentor that I had was a very friendly person, and I never felt afraid to approach them. So the way I leveraged my CChem mentor was initially I had a conversation first to dispel my doubts around a CChem and whether I was eligible and whether a career change in the middle would be okay. So I talked about any doubts I talked through with them. Secondly was I think there's a 6-month report that we have to put in for the CChem. At that point, I shared that report, a draft of that report with my CChem mentor, and had a conversation before that as well, just to understand, am I headed in the right direction? Is this what is this right? Is this what the assessors would like to see? And it gave me some confidence as I was compiling that. And then did the same at the 1-year mark, and then of course right before submitting it in the 2-year mark as well. But then I think where the mentor relationship comes in handy is when you identify areas where you don't have a lot of evidence and potentially an area of development for yourself. It can be hard to understand how do you get experience in this area, and your mentor can highlight opportunities for you, or can discuss existing experiences that you have and make you think of those experiences in a different way that you may not have thought of. So it's very powerful for you to have an open dialogue and open conversation with your mentor and establish that good working relationship with them right at the start.
Thank you, Sonalika. We'll quite often get asked questions about mentor-mentee relationships and what a mentor has to do. So that was great. Thank you. If there are no more questions, I think we should bring this to a close. The Padlet has all the slides in it, so you can download that from the Padlet, and the video will go up on the members area as soon as it is ready. So thank you everyone for coming. I'd like to thank Sonalika and my team for giving such good talks and sharing their insights. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Claire and Louise for supporting in the background there. Thank you very much, and thank you all for attending, and good luck with your CChem applications. We're here if you need us. Goodbye everyone. Not sure what I have to do to make the recording stop. End event, I guess.